Okay, hello English literature students. This is a quick PowerPoint lecture about one of the key contexts for Rossetti's poetry, and this is about the Pre Raphaelites, the artistic and cultural movement known as the Pre Raphaelites. Okay, so strictly speaking, the full phrase is the Pre Raphaelite Brotherhood, sometimes actually called the PRB. So if you've mentioned it once in an essay, you could shorten it to PRB if you wanted. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, as the name suggests, was formed by some young men in 1848, right in the middle of the 19th century. William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti were the founders, three young men, young artists who were feeling disenchanted with how British art was going and their own lack of success with the way they wanted to paint. And as we know, one of these fellows, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, was Christina Rossetti's brother. They were not happy with the British art establishment, which was embodied in the Royal Academy. That sort of had the most power and status of British art. It's where a lot of British teaching of artists happened, and there was an exhibition, or many exhibitions that they ran, and it was sort of almost like that was how you became established as an acceptable British artist, and these art painters were finding that they weren't getting accepted. But it wasn't just painters involved. The Brotherhood later included Christina Rossetti's other brother, William, and also another young fellow called James Collinson. And that's someone who asked Christina Rossetti to marry him, and she did become engaged to him before she broke it off. So she's very, very closely engaged with this group. Yeah, she's got brothers and sort of friends, I think it's fair to say, involved. They called themselves Pre Raphaelites, and if you say the word that way, Raphaelite, it'll hopefully remind you that it's the A before the E, because their ideal of art was to go back before this very famous Italian painter Raphael, who for the royal academicians, he was like the acme. Raphael was who they thought was brilliant and you should be aiming to be like. But the Pre-Raphaelites said, no, we should go back to an earlier style of art, earlier, purer Italian art. So often in the Christina Rossetti poems, we talk about medievalism and how she was drawn to medieval settings. And that's the kind of art that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were looking back to as well, medieval rather than Renaissance. Christina Rossetti was highly involved in a number of ways. One was modelling for her brother. Now bear that in mind, she would not be modelling for any of the others. Yeah, that was not a reputable thing for a young lady to do, but it was perfectly acceptable to model for your brother, particularly when he asks you to model the Virgin Mary. Yes, not one of these disreputable women that they also painted. So we saw earlier in one of the other slides a painting where he painted her as the Virgin Mary during the Annunciation. That is when the angel Gabriel comes to tell the Virgin Mary that she's going to become pregnant with God's son. And the painting you can see on the slide here, Christina Rossetti is being painted as the young Virgin Mary. The painting's called The Girlhood of Mary Virgin. So the girl without a headscarf on doing some sewing there, that's Christina Rossetti. When I said it was an artistic and a cultural movement, there were also poets were members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and they published a magazine which they called The Germ. Bear in mind, remember that was not associated with disease in the middle of the 19th century. The germ theory of disease had not yet been widely accepted. So germ just meant the beginning of something, the kernel of something. That's why it was called The Germ. Rossetti didn't want to be reading poems in public, and she did resist having the poems published under her own name, even though her brother wanted her to. And in later letters and diaries, her brother said she didn't want to put herself forward. She thought it was unfeminine. So it's an interesting reminder of, the contradictions for a Victorian woman who wanted to write. She could write, but she wasn't supposed to be ambitious. She wasn't supposed to seek publication because that would be unfeminine. She did, however, allow some of her poems to be published in this journal using a pseudonym, so not her own actual name. So we're going to talk about some of the features of Pre-Raphaelite paintings, and the thing is to think about how those features may also be found in some of Rossetti's poetry. So some of the features that made them stand out, identified them, is being faithful to nature in almost minute detail. Okay, so these are only tiny pictures of these paintings, but there's quite a lot of Pre-Raphaelite paintings in the Tate Gallery. So if you want to look on the Tate website, or if you ever get the chance to go to the Tate Gallery in London, then you can see these paintings. They're quite big, and you can see how minute the detail of the plants and flowers are. So the Pre-Raphaelites went out and painted in the landscape, capturing real light conditions. This was quite an unusual thing to do at the time. Most artists would have been in the studio. Millet, for example, spent the summer of 1851 painting the real river for this painting of Ophelia. And you can see in the picture there how it's almost like a photograph, how detailed that river bank is and the plants. The other thing that's very typical of Pre-Raphaelites is the vibrancy of the colours. Some of them look almost garish when you see them today, but that was part of this medieval, going back to medieval painting, which really had these bright, rich colours in them. And the other thing is to try and capture a sense of arrested movement, and that was also influenced by medieval Italian painting. The sorts of subjects that the Pre-Raphaelites chose to paint. Also think about how this might be similar to Rossetti's poetry. They did history paintings, often medieval. Also depicted religious stories, so the girlhood of young Mary there, that one of the most famous and controversial paintings that the Pre-Raphaelites did was the childhood of Christ as a young boy in the carpenter's workshop. Scenes from literature, especially Shakespeare and Keats, but they made them look very medieval. Keats wrote poetry set in medieval period, and they often depicted scenes from that. But also up to date, very interested in the plight of fallen women. So the painting on this scene is called The Awakening Conscience, and there's a worksheet where I explain in more detail how this painting depicts a mistress of a man, her conscience awakening and her deciding she's going to leave him and go and be a good person afterwards. That's what that painting depicts. On the other hand, lots of the women the Pre-Raphaelites painted challenged Victorian feminine stereotypes. So generally speaking, the Victorian feminine stereotype would be blonde, sort of petite, although rounded, but little mouth, little nose. Whereas lots of the Pre-Raphaelite women were painted were powerful, cruel, tempting, and potentially destructive. So in this slide, there's a painting by, I think this is by Dante, Gabriele Rossetti, and it's a painting of Lady Lilith. Lilith was a witch from the Old Testament, so she was a very dangerous lady, and she was a seductress as well. You can also see in that painting some of the very typical features of the idea of female beauty the Pre-Raphaelites had. Very, very drawn to red-haired women, which was not at the time thought as necessarily standard beauty. Also quite strong-jawed. Yeah, not little petite faces, big strong jaws, statuesque bodies, not little reed thin girls, but nice big girls. Almost masculine, some of the women look to us. And all their models painted from life, not idealized. Models tended to be working class, and some of the models that the Pre-Raphaelites used were people who, prostitutes. It was not a reputable thing for a young woman to do, because she'd have to be alone for a long period of time with a man who wasn't a relative, often without all your clothes on. So yeah, it wasn't a very reputable thing to do.